My mother-in-law called me a slur, and my fiancé took her side, so I packed my bags and left. I met Daniel on a cold January evening when most of the world seemed huddled inside warm houses, trying to avoid the endless chill of winter. My friend Alicia had invited me to a small get-together at her new apartment. She'd just moved across town, and she wanted to show the place off by having a handful of us over for a simple dinner and conversation. I still remember the way the snow flurried outside her windows, the icy wind rattling the glass, while inside, we stood around sipping cocoa and chatting in soft voices. That was the night Daniel walked into my life. He came with a friend of Alicia's I'd never met before, and there was something about his quiet smile and gentle eyes that intrigued me instantly. I was 31, had been single for a while, and wasn't looking for anything serious. Yet there was a spark, something indefinable between us from that very first moment. I have high-functioning autism. It doesn't affect my day-to-day life too dramatically, but sometimes I struggle with reading people's emotions or dealing with big, sudden changes. Despite my occasional difficulties with social cues, I found talking to Daniel easy. There was a warmth about him that encouraged me to speak openly. I wasn't self-conscious around him. That night, Alicia joked that she saw us hitting it off, but I brushed it aside with a laugh. I didn't realize how right she was. Daniel and I continued talking after that evening. We went on casual coffee dates, discovered we both liked walking through the local botanical gardens, and spent hours exchanging stories about our families. He told me about his mother, Katie, early on in our relationship. He described her as protective, strong-willed, and someone he deeply respected. She'd been widowed when Daniel was 10 and raised him and his younger sister, Marissa, on her own. He didn't mention any hostility on her part, nor did he insinuate that she might not be friendly. He simply said she was cautious around strangers. At the time, I thought that made sense. A single mother who'd lost her husband would, of course, want to protect her children. I had no idea that Katie's protection would extend into a deep antipathy toward me, or that her sense of entitlement over Daniel's life would spark so much heartache. Our relationship progressed quickly. It was like something out of a dream for a few months. Cozy afternoons in bookstores, spontaneous drives to scenic overlooks, nights spent in my small apartment curled up together under blankets while we planned the future. Even though we'd only been dating for several months, I felt as if I'd known him my whole life. My autism had sometimes complicated my past relationships. Men often misunderstood my quieter demeanor or my literal interpretations of certain jokes. But Daniel never treated me like I was strange. He asked questions about my experiences, how I perceived social situations, and seemed fascinated by my perspective. In turn, he shared details of his own life, his childhood, and his ambitions, as though unveiling them piece by piece to someone who would treat those details carefully. By the time he proposed, a little less than a year after we met, I was certain I wanted to spend my life with him. He knelt down in the snow on a freezing night, ring in hand, and asked me to marry. His face glowed with a love so earnest it brought tears to my eyes. I said yes through choked sobs. The ring was simple, with a small diamond set in a delicate band, and it felt like the perfect symbol of our bond. Even in that blissful moment, though, a slight tension lurked in the back of my mind. Although I'd met Katie a couple of times in passing at large family events, she had barely spoken to me. The few words she had said felt curt, and sometimes she simply acted like I didn't exist. But I shrugged it off, determined not to let that overshadow my happiness. I was convinced that once she got to know me, she'd see how I cared for Daniel. We announced our engagement to our friends, who were thrilled for us. We wanted to tell Katie in person, so we drove out to her home in the suburbs one Sunday afternoon, arriving with the ring on my finger and bright smiles on our faces. I remember being a bit nervous as we pulled into her driveway, which was lined with neatly trimmed hedges. The house itself was quaint, a single story with a small porch and a wreath on the door, giving it a welcoming facade. Inside, though, something about the atmosphere felt cold. It smelled faintly of lavender potpourri and freshly vacuumed carpets. Katie greeted us at the door, wearing a stiff expression. She led us to the living room where she sat down in her favorite chair, Daniel and I on the couch. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom," he said with a slight tremble in his voice, "Claire and I have some exciting news." I looked at Katie, noticing how her gaze lingered on me, almost like she was sizing me up. Daniel reached for my hand and gently lifted it, showing off the ring. "We're engaged," he announced. She stared at the ring for a beat, her lips in a tight, "Oh," she said, her tone devoid of warmth. That's a surprise." She leaned forward, and for a moment I thought I caught a flicker of anger. She folded her arms across her chest and turned to Daniel. "Are you sure this is wise?" she asked curtly. My stomach clenched, but I tried to remain composed. Daniel's eyes flicked toward me, then back to her. "Mom, we've been together for nearly a year and we love each other. It's important to me that you're part of our happiness." Katie drummed her fingers on the arm of her chair. "You just met her last year. Seems sudden to me, But what do I know, right? She let out a huff, then forced a thin-lipped smile that felt more condescending than congratulatory. I suppose congratulations are in order. I managed to say, thank you, though my voice came out quieter than I intended. She switched topics to something unrelated. Her neighbor's unruly dog, or how she was renovating her kitchen, and the subject of the engagement dissipated, left hanging in the air like a half-finished conversation. I told myself that at least she hadn't outright opposed it. Daniel tried to keep the mood light, but it was clear Katie had very little interest in discussing wedding plans. We left soon after, the tense air giving me a headache. That was the first time I realized Katie might not be merely protective. She might actively disapprove of. Over the following weeks, I noticed signs that she wasn't just neutral. She was hostile. Daniel mentioned that she'd made several comments like, she's uneducated, right? Or, can't you date someone a little more refined? Each time, he'd try to defend me, but often it devolved into Katie scolding him for betraying family in favor of an outsider. Their arguments never reached me direct. I heard about them secondhand through Daniel. I wanted him to put his foot down, but he said it was complicated. He loved me, but he also felt indebted to her for raising him alone after his father died. I tried to be patient, reminding myself that change takes time. But one day, a few months into our engagement, he and I visited her again. We were excited to share some of our wedding decisions, where we wanted to hold it, the time of year, the approximate guest list. Daniel thought maybe giving her a role in the planning would help her feel included. The meeting started awkwardly. Katie offered us tea, then sat with her arms full. Daniel tried to lighten the mood by pulling out his phone and showing pictures of the venue we were considering. That was when Katie said in a surprisingly calm voice, "Are you really going to marry that R-word gold digger?" She said the slur as if it were normal conversation, turning her face slightly so Daniel was forced to look at her. I remember the absolute shock that clapped over me. I'd rarely heard that word directed at me in my entire life. My chest seized up, my cheeks grew hot, and my eyes stung. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The cruelty and finality of that phrase shattered any illusions I had that Katie might warm up to me. I heard Daniel letting out a nervous laugh, perhaps trying to downplay it, but I jerked my head in his direction, my eyes full of tears. "Katie," I stammered, "why would you say that? Why would you—" She shrugged. "I'm just being honest. You know what I think? I think you're after his money and you're, well, not quite right in the head. I've seen your kind before. If I had been stunned before, now I felt physically ill. That she used a hateful slur about my autism was one thing, but she also implied I was scheming to take advantage of Daniel financially. We weren't even wealthy. Daniel made a comfortable living, but it wasn't as if he was a millionaire. I'd never shown the slightest interest in money. My job paid enough for me to handle my bills, and I valued independence above all. Everything about her accusation dripped with contempt. I stared at Daniel. He looked pale, uncertain, and furious with his mother. But instead of confronting her directly, he reached for my hand and mumbled something about us needing to go. He ushered me out of the house in a fog of confusion and shame. Once we were in the car, I broke down, sobbing so hard my voice felt ripped apart. Daniel wrapped his arms around me, whispering that he was sorry, that he loved me, that he'd fix it somehow. At the time, I believed he would. I kept saying, "You have to tell her to stop. You have to talk to her." And he promised me he would, though his voice trembled each time he repeated it. The next day, we argued. I asked if he'd confronted Katie, and he looked at the floor, murmuring that it was complicated. He told me he felt guilty standing up to her because she'd done so much for him and Marissa when they were children. He said he just wanted us to coexist, until Katie realized I wasn't the monster she believed me to be. I tried to explain that coexisting wasn't enough, not when she threw out slurs that belittled my identity. I told him that if we were planning a life together, he needed to defend me. My frustration swelled when I saw how torn he looked. A part of me understood his loyalty, but the rest of me reeled at the idea that this loyalty might overshadow our relationship. Days turned into weeks, and I noticed that instead of improving, things got worse. Katie made more comments in private to Daniel, derogatory remarks about my autism, my background, my habits. He relayed them to me only when I pressed him, and each time his excuses for not confronting her grew flimsier. I recall one evening, after I'd had enough, sitting on our couch with tears streaming down my face. I took his hands in mine and said, "Daniel, please, this has to stop. I need you to talk to her. I can't marry you if this continues. It's starting to feel like she hates me, and I can't handle that alone." He nodded, lips tight, but didn't promise anything concrete. That conversation ended with both of us exhausted, emotionally drained, unsure of what the next step should be. The following weekend, his sister Marissa texted me. I saw the message blink onto my phone screen. "Don't make him choose between you and Mom. That's not fair." I stared at the words in disbelief. I'd never asked him to choose between us. All I wanted was for Daniel to tell her to stop the insults. Couldn't Marissa see that Katie's behavior was pushing me away? Furious, I typed back a short reply, telling her that I wasn't making him choose, but I couldn't control Katie's words nor could I accept them. She never responded. It wasn't long after that when Daniel began acting as if nothing was wrong at all. He came home one day smiling, humming to himself, greeting me with a kiss like we were in a blissful bubble. Meanwhile, my internal turmoil grew. Every night, I replayed Katie's slur in my mind, feeling the sting anew. Daniel's nonchalance, his refusal to address the crisis, grated on me until I finally confronted him. I remember that evening in painful detail. We were in our small kitchen, bright overhead lights revealing every anxious line on my face, every bead of sweat on his brow. I demanded to know why he was ignoring our last fight, why he was pretending that the issue with his mother didn't exist. He tried to brush it off, saying, "Let's not dwell on it. It was a small fight and we can move forward." My frustration erupted in a wave of tears and anger. I told him I couldn't simply move forward when every part of me felt attacked by the woman who might become my mother-in-law. When I reminded him that Katie had called me a hateful slur, something that would scar me for the rest of my life, he responded by shrugging, then repeating that she was old and didn't understand the word's meaning. I stared at him in disbelief. Katie wasn't that old, only in her early 60s, and from the way she wielded that word, it was clear she understood its cruel weight perfect. I couldn't listen to more excuses. I packed a bag, called Alicia to pick me up, and left. Daniel barely tried to stop me, which hurt even more. He just stood there, tense, as if he knew he had no adequate justification for his passivity. At Alicia's place, I felt a mixture of relief and heartbreak. I'd left the man I loved, not because I stopped loving him, but because I loved myself enough not to endure abuse from his family. I cried, I paced the living room, and Alicia kept telling me I'd done the right thing. She promised I wasn't crazy or asking for too much. Wanting Daniel to defend me from slurs was a baseline requirement for marriage. Still, part of me clung to hope that Daniel would come to his senses. The next day, Alicia showed me a post on Reddit. It was from Daniel. He'd written an "Am I the a-holest" post, describing our fight in a way that painted me as the unreasonable one. He wrote that his mother was getting older and didn't fully understand what she was saying, that I was pushing him to cut her out because I didn't understand the bond of a single-parent family. The comments were brutal, calling him out on how he was enabling hateful behavior. I felt relief reading them, because at least strangers saw the situation for what it was. Yet I also felt betrayal course through me. He'd twisted the story publicly to garner sympathy. Why would he do that? In response, I posted my own version. People flooded my inbox with support, urging me to stand my ground. That same day, Daniel called me. I picked up because, despite everything, I still missed him. The person on the other end of the line was not the loving man I remembered. He sounded unhinged, crying one minute, screaming profanities the next, demanding I come home. I tried to speak calmly, to ask him why he wouldn't stand by me against his mother, but he spiraled between begging and yelling. I ended the call, hands shaking, tears rolling down my cheeks, and blocked him. A few hours later, he showed up at Alicia's door, pounding on it, shouting that I needed to come with him immediately. When he wouldn't leave, we had no choice but to call the police. The officers arrived, saw how agitated he was, and escorted him away. That was the moment I realized something in Daniel had snapped, or perhaps had always been on the verge of snapping. Under the stress of his mother's disapproval, I packed a small suitcase and left to stay at a hotel, not wanting to endanger Alicia by remaining at her apartment. My sense of safety was shaken. I hoped that might be the end of it, that maybe the police intervention would calm him down. In the days that followed, I considered my future. Was it truly over between us? And if it was, how did I grieve the loss of someone I loved so deep? But then a part of me wondered, was there a path to redemption? If Daniel sought therapy, if he recognized the toxicity of his mother's behavior, could we ever rebuild our life together? The turning point came a week later, when I found a handwritten letter slipped under my hotel room door. It was from Daniel. In it, he apologized for his breakdown, saying he'd never felt so cornered and lost before. He said he loved me and realized he'd failed me. He wrote that the Reddit comments had opened his eyes to how enabling he'd been, how unacceptable it was not to defend me from such bigotry. He admitted he was scared of confronting his mother because of how deeply he felt he owed her everything, his education, his upbringing, but that he was prepared now to set boundaries if it meant getting me back. I spent hours reading and rereading the letter, my emotions a swirling storm of anger, hurt, and a lingering spark of hope. In the end, I agreed to meet him in a public cafe. We sat at a table by the window, hearts in our throats. He looked thinner, with dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. His voice shook as he told me how terrified he was of losing, how he never wanted to hurt me, and how the meltdown at Alicia's was him hitting rock bottom. He asked if I could ever trust him again. I searched his face looking for sincerity. "What do you plan to do about your mother?" I asked quietly. "Because if we're going to be together, she can't keep treating me like this, and you can't let her." He inhaled, steadied himself, and said, "I promise. If she can't respect you, then she doesn't get to have me in her life. I'm going to try therapy. I'm going to learn how to set boundaries. I don't want this to be words only. I'll show you with my actions." A tremor of relief flickered in my chest, tempered by the memory of him screaming at me not even a week before. "I'm open to seeing if that's possible," I said, tears welling up, "but it's not going to be easy. I can't promise I'll stay if it goes back to how it was." He nodded, swallowing. "I understand. I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Over the next month, he began therapy sessions, both individual and family. He even arranged a counseling appointment with his mother and me in the room, which I agreed to only if a trained professional was there to moderate. Katie arrived at that session with a stony expression, and it took a good hour for her to even admit that she'd said anything hurtful. She claimed that she was just telling the truth and looking out for Daniel. But the therapist gently pressed her on why she used such a hateful slur, explaining how bigoted and damaging it was. She initially tried to shrug it off as if it were no big deal. But Daniel, for the first time, told her directly that if she ever insulted me again, we would both walk away from her life. She stared at him in shock. I realized how monumental a moment it was. He was finally pushing back, refusing to let her dictate our relationship. Though Katie didn't apologize in a way that felt genuine. She muttered something about not using that word anymore because everyone's so sensitive. It was a step. And so began a slow and difficult path toward healing. I didn't move back in with Daniel immediately. I stayed at Alicia's for a while, carefully observing how he handled interactions with Katie. I saw him hang up the phone on her once when she began criticizing me, telling her that if she didn't speak respectfully, he wouldn't continue the conversation. It was a sudden shift, and Katie reacted with indignation and tears, scolding him for abandoning her after all she'd done. But he stayed firm. Each time he'd come to me, exhausted, yet resolute, reminding me that our relationship mattered most. Trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight. For me, the memory of him scoffing at Katie's slur was still raw. The day he let that hateful word pass by without immediate condemnation replayed in my mind often. But he was consistent, and consistency was what I needed. I also sought therapy, wanting to work through the trauma of being targeted so directly because of my autism, as well as the sense of betrayal I'd felt when Daniel initially did nothing. By the time a few months had passed, we'd begun speaking tentatively about resuming wedding plans. I felt nervous. I hadn't fully regained my faith that Katie wouldn't sabotage our wedding day. But Daniel assured me that if she tried anything, he wouldn't hesitate to leave her out entirely. Part of me ached at the thought of a groom's mother not being present for a wedding, but I had to prioritize my well-being. I told Daniel that if we were to set a date again, it needed to be a smaller, more private ceremony, and he agreed. As for Katie, she never truly warmed up to me. She remained guarded and distant, occasionally letting slip a passive-aggressive remark about how Daniel could have done so much better, or questioning my educational background. But she did stop using explicit slurs. I didn't expect warmth from her. I only hoped for tolerance. Daniel and I both accepted that Katie might never apologize outright or view me as anything more than an intrusion into her son's life. Yet we discovered that a relationship could function on superficial politeness if real closeness was impossible. Marissa, meanwhile, reached out to me privately. She apologized for telling me not to make Daniel choose between us. She said she hadn't known the extent of their mother's insults. She'd assumed it was just a small quip or two, not a pattern of demeaning language. Marissa explained that she'd grown up under their mother's strong influence, so it was hard for her to believe Katie could be genuinely hateful. Once Marissa saw how upset Daniel was, how undone he'd become by the conflict, she realized something serious was happening. We agreed to try to have a cordial relationship, and over time, we managed to talk about lighter topics, shared shows we liked, or our mutual interest in crafting. It felt good to at least have one person in Daniel's family who tried to understand me. Eventually, Daniel and I selected a new wedding date in July. We sent out invitations to close friends and a few supportive relatives on both sides, making the ceremony intentionally small. The day was bright and hot, with a golden sun beating down on a garden venue near Alicia's childhood home. I remember standing there in a simple ivory dress, my hair pinned up, a mixture of nerves and excitement clashing in my stomach. The wedding was everything I dreamed of, intimate, with a few rows of chairs set up in a circle around a small trellis. Alicia acted as my maid of honor, beaming at me with tears in her eyes. I walked toward Daniel, who wore a tailored suit that complemented his calm demeanor, but I noticed the tension in his jaw as his eyes flicked to the small gathering of guests. Katie was there, sitting in the back, next to Marissa. She wore a look of forced neutrality, as if she'd have rather been anywhere else. But she kept quiet. She didn't try to interrupt, didn't hurl any insults. Marissa sat with her hands folded, occasionally glancing between Katie and us as though ready to intervene if her mother spoke out of turn. When Daniel and I exchanged vows, we looked into each other's eyes, remembering the storm we'd weathered to get there. We promised to protect each other, cherish each other, and never let anyone, no matter how close, belittle our love. The officiant declared us husband and wife, and for a moment, it felt like the world melted away. I saw tears on Daniel's cheeks, and I knew that, Despite everything, he was committing fully to me now. The applause from our guests warmed me, and even though Katie clapped half-heartedly, it was a relief not to have her sabotage that moment. Afterward, Katie slipped away quick, offering no real congratulations beyond a stiff nod. Part of me was relieved she'd left without causing a scene. Another part was sad that our union wouldn't be something she truly celebrated. Daniel told me quietly that he'd talk to her later, which seemed to be his constant refrain. For that day, though, I didn't want to think about her. I was happy. Daniel and I had proven that we could come back from the brink of disaster if we truly valued our relationship enough to fight for it. In the weeks following the wedding, we settled into a new apartment. We both had therapy appointments lined up, couples counseling and individual sessions. We knew we had a lot to learn about open communication, conflict resolution, and boundary setting, especially in regard to Katie. She remained in Daniel's life in a limited capacity, often trying to undermine me subtly, but Daniel stood firm in pushing back on her. He became adept at saying, "Mom, I won't allow you to speak that way about my wife," or even hanging up when she escalated. Slowly, I felt my guard relax. The man who'd once let her get away with a hateful slur was now telling her that such behavior had consequences. In time, Katie found she had little choice but to begrudgingly adjust if she wanted to maintain a connection with her son. She never became warm or affectionate toward me. She rarely did more than curtly acknowledge me. Sometimes I caught a trace of remorse in her eyes, but she never articulated an apology. I made peace with the fact that we would likely never have the close mother-daughter relationship I'd once fantasized about. I'd hoped we might become friends, but I realized that for some people, letting go of prejudice or control is too difficult. That was her journey, not mine to force. I only needed her to respect the boundaries Daniel and I had set. The memory of being called that R-word gold digger haunted me for a long time. Every now and then, I'd wonder if Katie really believed those words, or if she was so accustomed to gatekeeping Daniel's life that she latched onto any method, no matter how cruel, to drive away potential partners. Either way, I use those memories to remind myself of what I would and wouldn't accept in my life. The struggles we endured formed a set of guiding principles for our marriage. We'd always back each other up, always address red flags early, and never brush off hatred or bigotry as minor or a misunderstanding. Daniel's meltdown, which had escalated into him showing up at Alicia's apartment in a frenzy, still stood out as one of the darkest moments I'd witnessed from someone I loved. In the months after our wedding, he opened up about how panicked he'd felt. He believed he was losing, believed that every negative comment from strangers on Reddit confirmed his worst fears about being a bad partner, and believed that if he took my side, he was betraying his mother. The clash of those forces triggered a breakdown. I told him that while I empathized with his emotional turmoil, it didn't excuse his behavior. He agreed and continued with therapy to handle stress and boundary issues. Slowly, his outbursts disappeared, and we communicated more openly about our emotions rather than letting them explode all at once. Marissa tried to mediate between Katie and me at times, but I eventually asked her to step back. Mediation was the therapist's job, and I didn't want to confuse the family dynamic further by having Marissa play the role of a referee. We kept our conversations friendly, talking about Marissa's work or sometimes having coffee together, but we avoided the heavy subject of Katie unless absolutely necessary. Marissa seemed relieved to be out of the line of fire. She confided in me that while she cared for her mother, she hated the rifts that formed around Katie's unyielding opinions. I felt sympathy for her. It must have been hard, growing up watching Katie push away anyone she deemed unworthy. I realized that, in some sense, Marissa might have spent her whole life anxious to win Katie's approval. Now, she was watching as Daniel broke that pattern in order to protect. During our first holiday season as newlyweds, we made the decision to host Thanksgiving dinner at our apartment, inviting only a small number of guests. My parents lived in another state and planned to fly in, and Alicia would come by to see them. We also extended an invitation to Katie and Marissa, though with reservations. I was surprised when Katie accepted. She showed up that afternoon, bringing a store-bought apple pie, which she handed to me without much of a greeting. My parents, who had only briefly met Katie at the wedding, tried making small talk, but Katie's replies were clipped. Still, no insults were thrown, no slurs uttered. For someone like Katie, that was progress. Daniel put an arm around me at one point, and I felt him trembling. He was worried, but the night passed smoothly enough. It was the first time I allowed myself a whisper of hope that coexisting could become a reality. As winter deepened, Daniel and I talked about how to navigate the future. Would we ever want kids, knowing that Katie might try to impose her controlling nature on how we raised them? The thought scared me, but Daniel said that if we did, we'd set even stricter boundaries. We both recognized that parenthood would open new vulnerabilities. That conversation remained tentative, something for the distant future. For now, we focused on strengthening our marriage and learning to trust each other again. Each time Daniel chose me, when Katie tried to push back or question my decisions and he sided with me, my heart healed a little bit. One morning, A few months after Thanksgiving, I woke up and lay in bed, watching sunlight filter through the curtains. Daniel was still asleep beside me, his chest rising and falling in gentle rhythms. I thought about how close we'd come to losing each other. The memory of me sobbing in Alicia's living room, the memory of him screaming through the phone, the way my heart had clenched when Katie's cruel words first hit my ears. A part of me wished none of that had happened, but another part recognized that we'd grown from it. We understood each other more deeply now. We valued each other's feelings in a way we might not have if everything had remained easy and unchallenged. Eventually, Daniel stirred, opened his eyes, and smiled at me. I returned his smile. We didn't need words to acknowledge what we'd been through or how we'd survived. I slipped out of bed, made us coffee, and decided to let the day unfold without thinking too much about Katie or old wounds. Sometimes, just living in the present moment, with all its simple joys, was the best therapy. Months continued to roll by, and Katie maintained a sort of resigned truce. Whenever we visited her, Daniel made sure I was never alone with her, so she couldn't corner me into a hurtful conversation. I occasionally saw glimpses of pity or confusion in her eyes, as though she couldn't understand why Daniel continued to love me despite all the ways she believed I was flawed. But at least she kept her mouth shut. Marissa hinted that Katie might be going to a counselor, though Katie never admitted it. If she was, perhaps it was helping in some small way. One day, Katie even invited us to her house for a short meal. We accepted, with caution, and while there, I noticed she'd put up new pictures on her mantle, some of Daniel alone, some of Marissa's graduation photos. There was even a small photo of me and Daniel from our wedding, half hidden behind the others, but I spotted it. It felt like the faintest gesture of acknowledgement, if not true acceptance. When we left that evening, Katie followed us to the door. She looked at Daniel, then at me, and mumbled, "Take care," 2 words, delivered with reluctance but also without obvious venom. In her world, that might have been as close as she could get to a good night or a genuine farewell. Daniel and I got into the car and drove away in silence for a few minutes. Finally, he exhaled and said, "I know it's not everything we want, but it's something, right?" I nodded, resting my hand on his knee. It was enough for now. There are still days I wonder if I made the right choice. If life might have been easier if I walked away completely, found someone whose family wasn't riddled with conflict and tension. But love doesn't always follow the easiest path. The depth of my feelings for Dan, the unwavering devotion I saw in him once he realized his mistakes, kept me tethered to this relationship. And in time, those threads of hope and forgiveness wove together into a strong bond, a marriage I can believe in. He learned to stand up for me, and I learned to trust him again, bit by bit, day by day. Today, if a friend asks me whether I'd recommend persevering in a relationship where a partner's family is hostile, I say it depends on whether your partner is willing to defend you and whether you truly believe in the bond you share. If they won't speak up, if they consistently put their family's hateful words above your dignity, then it's probably not going to work. But if they show genuine commitment to change, if they demonstrate by actions, not just words, that they will protect you, then maybe there's hope. It won't be painless, but it can lead to a deeper connection forged in adversity. As for Katie, I've accepted that we might never be close. Our interactions are likely to remain polite at best, strained at worst. She sees me as someone who took her son away, someone who doesn't meet her standards, and she may never let go of those biases. But she does keep her vitriol in check now, and Daniel and I have established a life that revolves around our own happiness, not her opinions. He calls her once a week, checks on her health, invites her to certain family gatherings if we know she'll behave. Sometimes she comes, often she refuses. Either way, Daniel and I continue our own path. We celebrate each other's victories, support each other's dreams, and deal with challenges together. That's what marriage is about, and no external force, including a disapproving mother, can take that from us. When I think back to the moment I first saw Daniel at Alicia's small gathering, sipping cocoa by the fire, I remember the sense of promise in his eyes. That promise evolved into something real, a marriage tempered by trials but ultimately standing firm. I'm proud of who we became. I learned how strong I could be, how much I was willing to stand up for myself and my value. Daniel learned to overcome the binding pressures of familial guilt, to become his own person, to defend the woman he loved. It wasn't a fairy tale progression. It was messy, heartbreakingly real, but it led us to a mutual respect and love we might never have discovered otherwise. So here we are, 2 people who met in the depths of winter, who found spring in each other's company, and who weathered a freezing storm caused by a mother's hostility. Our story reminds me that love is rarely simple or straightforward. It's tested in the crucible of conflict. But for us, the test made us stronger, forging a union that endures despite everything. I choose Daniel, with all his flaws and fears, and he chooses me, with all my complexities and sensitivities. We stand together, living a life that is ours to shape, ours to protect, and ours to cherish, no matter who stands against it.